Hey, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to take a look at a brand new power station from a relatively new brand that I have actually up until now not had any prior experience with, because in fact they've only been in business for about 2 years, and up until now they've mostly been focused on smaller capacity power stations, and that's a sub 600 watt hour or so capacity range. And I have to admit that when UDPOWER first reached out to me about reviewing this brand new S1200 power station, I was a little reluctant to accept the project because I hadn't heard of them before. And I do try to be fairly selective about what I feature on the channel. But after taking a closer look at the specs on this particular unit, I told them to go ahead and send it over so I could at least get my hands on it, and then I could decide if it was worth sharing with you guys. And to spare you the suspense, this unit was a bit of a pleasant surprise. So here goes. So first, let's quickly run through the important specs on this S1200, and then per usual, we'll see how it holds up in testing. So as the name implies, the S1200, this unit has a pure sine wave AC inverter that is rated for a continuous output of up to 1200 watts, and it is using lithium iron phosphate battery cells that are rated to maintain at least 80% of their original 1,191 watt hours of capacity, even after a full 3,000 cycles. Now, as you can see from the front of the unit, for outputs, it's got 5 3-prong AC outlets, along with 6 USB ports, 2 of which are USB-C PD100 ports, which is nice for charging laptops and tablets on the go without having to have that separate charging adapter with you. And then just to the left of the USB ports is a typical 12 volt 10 amp accessory socket, and then a couple of DC 5521 accessory ports. Now also on the front, there's dual LED lights flanking that LCD display. And then on top of the unit, it does have a 15 watt wireless charging built in, which is kind of one of those welcome little nice to have features, along with this flat top and a fold down handle, which makes the unit a bit easier to store into tight spaces. And then around on the back of the unit, you'll find the main inputs for AC charging and then also solar charging via the standard XT60 connector. Now, the solar input allows a max of 400 watts total with a voltage range of 12 to up to 75 volts with a cap at 12 amps. And that 75 volt max voltage is actually quite generous for a mid-range capacity power station like this, since most will cap out somewhere between 30 and 40 volts. And that does give you some extra flexibility that you might not otherwise have. So say you start out with a single 100 watt or maybe a 200 watt 18 volt panel. Maybe you later decide to add an additional panel to speed up solar charging. Well, with that 75 volt max, you can just easily connect those panels in series without having to buy parallel branch connectors in order to connect them. And it also makes it easier to over panel this unit if you want to. And as it turns out, that's another area where this unit pleasantly surprised me, and I'll demonstrate that once we get into the testing. Now also, they do give you a separate DC 7909 input here on the front that's intended for charging the unit from a car's 12 volt socket. And by the way, it's worth noting that they do provide the car charging cable in the box, but they do not include an XT60 solar cable, which shouldn't be a big deal since most portable panels already come with one anyway, and these kinds of cables are readily available on Amazon for somewhere around $10 or $15 if you happen to find yourself needing one. So to kind of wrap up on the specs, the S1200 weighs in at a very manageable 26 pounds, and it measures 13.7 inches wide. It's about 9.7 inches tall and about, say, 9.5 inches deep. And UDPOWER warranties this unit for a full 5 years. Okay, enough spec talk. Let's go see how this little S1200 holds up in testing. All right, as you can see, we are fully charged at 100%. The birds are chirping outside even though it's raining. But we're going to do a discharge capacity test on this S1200, find out how many usable watt hours we can actually get out of it. All right, so since this is a 1200 watt inverter, we're going to try to get close to a 0.2C discharge rate. We're going to be just probably a little bit over that. I think 240 watts would technically be 0.2C, but we want to try to get as close to that as we can. I'm going to go ahead and plug this in. Actually, do it without plugging in the load just yet. I want to check the output voltage and see what kind of output voltage we're getting. Oh, I'm kind of surprised. I actually was expecting us to get 110 volts, but we're actually getting the full 120. So that's a nice surprise. So let me go ahead and plug in the load, and let's see how many watts we're actually going to get. I could dial that down just a little bit since it looks like it's going to stay pretty steady. All right, so we're within 35 or so watts of 0.2C. Let's go ahead and let this run all the way down. According to the display there, it does give me a timer based on the current load. It's saying 4.8 hours. So we will check back when it's done and see how many watt hours we actually accumulated. All right, looks like our usable capacity test out of the AC inverter is completed. Let's go ahead and plug this watt meter into grid power so we can read it. And as you can see, we have registered a total of 960 watt hours. So out of that rated 1,191 watt hours, that is a low side average of about 80% of rated capacity. And I say low side average because I typically read somewhere between 80 and 84, maybe 85% through the AC inverters on these tests. And so I would put this on the low end of that range as a low side average. All right, I just started recharging this after performing a no load draw test. And this is where we ended up after 5 hours. So if we were to do the math on that, that equates to 1.2% of total capacity per hour that you leave the inverter on, approximately 15 watts continuous. So that's not unusual for an inverter this size. I would say that's an average no-load draw for this S1200. All right, once we get this thing fully topped off, we're gonna do a DC discharge capacity test and find out how much usable capacity we get out of this 12 volt 10 amp DC port. So we're fully charged up here. I've got my battery tester connected to the 12 volt output here just below, and I've got it set for 10 amps. So the first thing we're gonna do is turn it on and see if we can actually draw 10 amps. So let me go ahead and turn on the DC outputs, and we can see we're right there, just a hair shy of 12 volts, so 11.96 volts. 12 volts for all intents and purposes. Let's go ahead and start, and we'll find out how many watt hours we actually get out of that rated 1191 through that DC port. All right, looks like our DC discharge capacity test is done. Let's zoom in here and see what we got. So out of a rated 1,100 and I believe it was 91 watt hours, we got 1,002 watt hours. So that's actually a pretty respectable number out of that DC port, just a little over 84% of rated. So that's on the high side of average for my DC tester. So pretty decent numbers for this S1200 on the power you can get through this little 12 volt 10 amp DC port. All right, time to do a noise test on the AC output from this S1200. I'm going to use my old guitar amp here, and it has no noise suppression built in, and it has actually not even a grounding pin. So I've got it connected to grid power first as a baseline. Let's hear what it sounds like through clean grid power. All right, now let me go ahead and switch it over to the S1200. I've already got the inverter on, so let's go ahead and fire this thing up and see what it sounds like. All right, once again, I'm fairly surprised at just how clean that is. So this would be suitable for remote power source, for guitar amps, remote PA systems, probably ham radios, things like that, because the power coming out of this is pretty clean, actually quite comparable to grid power. All right, let's do a test on the solar input for this S1200. Now it does have a solar spec of a minimum of 12 volts up to a maximum of 75 volts, and it is capped at a total of 400 watts and 12 amps. So obviously the key spec there is you can't exceed 75 volts. So I'm going to over panel this thing. I have got 4 200 watt panels. Since those have a volts open circuit or VOC spec of about 23 volts, if I put them all in series, I'll have 23 times 4, which is going to put me well over that 75 volt max. So what I'm going to do is combine 2 of them in series, or make 2 series pairs, and that'll give me 2 series pairs of about 46 volts open circuit, but in reality it'll be more like 40 or 41 volts. And I'm going to put those in parallel. So then that will just raise the available current from what would normally be about 12 amps if they were all in series to about 24 amps. So this thing is never going to draw more than 12 amps. So the amps are pulled from the charge controller. but the volts are pushed. That's why we can't exceed that 75 volts. So I went ahead and measured this and when the sun was out, and I am getting a pretty consistent like 42 volts. So that's well within the range of this unit. So we've got it over paneled. It has the capability of producing up to 800 watts, but this only has the capability of consuming only 400 watts. Anyway, just wanted to explain that. Let's go ahead and plug that in. And we will get a little bit of input here. And it detected the solar connection right away, which causes it to sort of boot up and go through its power cycle. And we're pulling in a whopping 5 watts right now. And that is because it is 8 o'clock at night and the sun is down, but there's a little bit of ambient light. So we're gonna let this thing kind of just do what it's gonna do overnight, which is probably nothing except go to sleep. And we'll see if it'll wake and charge on its own in the morning without me having to unplug or replug or press any buttons or anything like that. And then once we see how it behaves on the wake and charge, we're gonna let it go ahead and charge tomorrow since we do have a reasonable sunny-ish day tomorrow. We'll see if we can top this thing off in less than a full day of sun. All right, so we'll see you in the morning and we'll find out what's what. All right, it is actually 11 a.m. the next day, but got bright sunshine. And as you can see, we're not only waking and charging just fine, we're at 43% already, and we're showing 439 watts. Now this thing is rated for 400 watts. And as I mentioned, I overpaneled it with 800 watts in that 2S2P configuration, but we're actually getting a little bit more, actually 10% more than the rated 400 watts. So the implications of this are that with this kind of solar input at a capacity of only just under 1200 watt hours, we should be able to top this thing off in well under a full day of good sky conditions. In fact, probably we'll have this thing topped off by about 1 p.m. would be my guess, since the sun is just now mostly aligned with my solar panels, and we are pegging this thing. So yeah, the solar input spec on this unit is definitely sufficient to get this thing topped off very quickly. All right, it is now 1:30 p.m. and we are at 100%. And by the way, I did check on it about an hour after that last clip, and we were already at 80% and we were still pegged at 439 watts. So yeah, definitely good solar charging performance on this S1200, especially if you overpanel it. All right, let's do some load testing on this S1200 and see if it can sustain that 1200 watt rated output continuously for 10 full minutes. So I'm going to dial this up and try to get it as close to 1200 watts output as I can, and then we'll start the timer. So currently we're outputting, if I zoom in there just a little bit, about 766 watts, and we are holding steady at 119.7 volts. So that's pretty cool. So let me go ahead and start taking this up, and let's see how close to 1200 watts we can actually get. And we'll monitor the voltage here just to see if there's any voltage drop along the way. Now this display wants to keep shutting off. All right, so we're at 1194, so 6 watts shy of max, and this thing is still completely silent, which is a little surprising and impressive. Let's go ahead and start that timer. All right, we finished the full 10 minutes. And as you saw, the sound decibel meter never got above 50 decibels, which is really surprising. A lot of times these smaller sort of mid-range power stations tend to be a little bit noisy with the cooling fans, especially when running full out for long periods of time. And this one is definitely an exception. So very quiet. The fans did come on, and I'll put a microphone up here so you can hear them. They're very, it's a very quiet, neutral white noise. So while not completely silent, and it's pretty rare for power stations to be completely silent, especially when they're doing load testing like this, this is one of the quietest 1200 watt hour power stations that I have tested so far. So very impressive. So I'm going to put the timer back up here, and we're going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to just see what happens. You can see we're at just under 1200 watts right now, 1177 or 1180. Let's try taking it up another 100 watts and we'll see how this thing behaves and when we actually trip overload protection. Here we go, 1270. I don't see any indication on screen that we are overloading. I should have started the timer. So that's already been at least 30 seconds. All right, let's take it up a little bit more. Let's find out where the tripping point is. So we're at 1362. This is a full 168 watts above rated. And I don't see it indicating an overload yet. Oh, it looks like we just did. Yeah, it dropped out and now it's going to try to reapply the load. So there is a little bit of overhead on that 1200 watt inverter, but the key thing that you take away from this is that it is a definite pass on the 1200 watts continuous, because it'll give you that and just a little bit more. Now, there is one kind of interesting quirk about this S1200, and I've seen this, I think, one other time, and that is the 12 volt socket here is relatively shallow. In fact, if I were to measure the front edge all the way back to the contact point, it would be about 1.25 inches, which is fine for some types of these 12 volt plugs. As you can see, they work just fine. This one should work just fine. And that's because these are about 1.25 inches from tip to the secondary contacts in the back. But if you look at something like this, this is more like 1.5 inches. And due to the shape of this particular connector, this is for a 12 volt adapter for a DC fridge. This will not fit because this is too shallow. Whereas on the other hand, if you look at something that's got more like a 1.5 inch depth, like this guy, that fits just fine. But it won't fit this fairly shallow one. So, and the reason I point that out is because I did discover that when I was running my 24-hour DC fridge test on this, which it did pass, by the way, but I had to run it through the AC inverter. And after 24 hours, I had no problem. I had eco mode turned on, which means that for really intermittent loads, the unit might turn off, but it did not turn off on me in terms of shutting my refrigerator down, which is what the point of that test is, to make sure it'll run a DC fridge. So, I mean, if it had, I could have just simply turned that to normal and it would not have been a problem. And just for reference, with this small, I think it was about a 35 quart DC fridge, I was putting it at a set point of about 38 degrees Fahrenheit in both the freezer and the fridge section. And then I stocked it about half full with soft drinks, and I just let it run for 24 hours. And I think I went from 67% down to 24% state of charge. So you could easily get a couple of days out of this, for running a DC fridge. Right, so looking at the AC charging here, we do have a fast charging option, which we are currently running, which is about 800 watts in, and an optimized, which is a slower charge rate designed to help extend the overall service life of the battery cells, because charging at a slower rate does stress them less than charging at a faster rate. So if I were to switch that on the fly over to optimized, we can watch that charge rate drop from 800 watts to, it looks like, about 400 watts. So you can cut that charge rate in half. So if you're not in a hurry, you can let this thing set at optimized, about 400 watts, and that'll get you charged up in maybe just a little over 3 hours. Or if you are in a hurry, you can charge it up at the fast charging setting, which will get you charging at about 800 watts and get this thing topped off in about 1.5 hours. All right, we're going to do a quick UPS test on this S1200. Got it charged at 100%. If I zoom in here on the screen a little bit, you see we're outputting 460 watts. It doesn't show that we're inputting anything, but I do have grid power attached in the back, and you can see there's a little label on the top that says UPS Prime, and that's UDPOWER's name for their UPS mode. So that basically means it's detecting grid power, passing it through. So let's simulate a power outage by removing power from the back, and I assume that little label there will go away when I do that, and we'll see if my PC has any problem with that at all. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Okay, PC is still running, no problem. You saw the little light go away, telling me that I'm no longer in UPS mode. I'm running strictly off battery power. So let me try adding grid power back and see if it will go the other way. Took about 2 seconds. I didn't notice anything happening on the screen. Looks like the PC is completely happy, and we are back to pass-through power. So UPS mode on this S1200 is a definite pass, and because it is virtually silent, it makes it particularly well suited to be under a desk like this, functioning as a UPS. All right, so really, other than that small quirk with the somewhat shallow 12-volt socket, the S1200 is actually a surprisingly solid performer. And I'd go so far as to say that this unit is a little above average for mid-range 1000 watt class in a couple of areas. So first of all, I was surprised to see that during the solar charging, we actually got a bit more than that spec 400 watts, about 10% more. So if you wanted to over panel this unit, while obviously making sure you keep below that 75 volt maximum threshold, that will help you ensure that you can fully recharge this S1200 on solar alone in as little as about, I would say 3.5 hours or so, which is more than adequate for most people, especially on a power station in this particular capacity class. And then also for a unit in this capacity class, I have to give this unit some recognition for being one of the quietest that I've tested. And for some of you, myself included, that's a much appreciated feature. Now, I don't think I mentioned it before, but the S1200 does not have mobile app control. And I know that for some of you, that's actually a pro and not a con. And for those of you who might be inclined to see that as a con, I just again point out that they do actually give you physical buttons to control things like charging speed and also to enable or disable the auto shutdown timeouts. And at least for me, that's pretty much what I primarily use the mobile apps for anyway. And if I'm being honest with myself, I kind of like having the physical buttons to gain control of those things because it's generally more convenient anyway. Okay, so let's finally talk about how the S1200 is priced. This is another area where I was surprised, only this time in not quite as good a way. Now, UDPOWER is introducing this S1200 at a price of $599, which without any discounts applied would put this kind of in the premium price tier with more established brands like EcoFlow or Blue Eddy or maybe even Jackery, for example. So when I expressed this concern to UDPOWER, they actually came back to me with a pretty healthy discount code that will get that price down to a much more budget competitive price of about $467. And at that price, I do think that this S1200 is a very solid option worth considering if you're in the market for a budget priced but still reasonably full featured mid-range power station. Now, I don't know how long that discount code is going to last, but per usual, I will leave links to that code along with links to this S1200 down in the video description below if you do want to go check it out. Okay, I think that's a wrap. Hopefully you found something in the video useful or maybe informative in some way. And if you did, I'd very much appreciate it if you'd be so kind as to click that like button down below for me. And if you do have any lingering questions about this S1200 that I didn't already answer in the video for you, please do leave those in the comments section below, and I will do my best to try and answer those questions for you. I thank you for spending some of your valuable time with me today, and I do hope you'll consider coming back for the next one. And until then, have fun out there.